Hello everyone, this is Reon and welcome to Econ is Life. So today we're going to talk about government intervention. We have three different types of government intervention, which are indirect tax, price control, and subsidy. But today we're focusing on indirect tax. Okay, so first let's do a quick review on market equilibrium. Here's a diagram of a market where there are demand and supply curves, and as we learned in the previous video, market equilibrium is where demand and supply meets. In other words, demand curve and supply curve crosses each other. So as you can see on this diagram, um, the equilibrium price will be PE, and the equilibrium quantity will be QE, which is the place where demand and supply meets. Okay, and in this diagram, there is no government intervention, which means there's no external intervention to a market. So this represents a free market where demand and supply determines the price of a product. Okay, so the question is, what's government intervention? It's a regulatory actions taken by a government in order to affect or interfere with decisions made by individuals, groups, or organizations regarding social and economic matters. This definition seems a little complicated, but put that in simple way. It's how government intervenes to a market, which solves economic problems and some other issues. Okay, so here it's important to remember that free market and government intervention is an opposite thing. Free market is where there is no government intervention, and in other words, demand and supply determines the market price. So yeah, as I wrote it here, market forces of demand and supply sets the price. But in reality, things don't go so easy. We have so many economic problems, and someone needs to correct those problems, and that is when government starts to intervene in a market. So there are mainly three purposes of government intervention. One is to correct for market failures. Second is to achieve a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. And third is to improve the performance of the economy. We're going to talk about these problems in later videos, but today we're just focusing on what is government intervention and then how that affects the market. So yeah, we're talking about indirect tax. Indirect tax is a tax imposed on consumption of goods and services. So for example, an indirect tax on cigarette. If you want to buy a cigarette, you have to pay a certain amount of tax to a government. That's indirect tax. It's a tax imposed on consumption of goods, not on income or not on wealth. Okay, so we have two different types of indirect tax. One is specific tax. It's a specific or fixed amount of tax that is imposed upon a product. For example, let's say there's a specific tax of $1 per unit. So let's say a $1 tax on cigarette. That means tax is always $1 at any price level. So the amount of tax is the same always at any price level. On the other hand, the second type of indirect tax, which is percentage tax, is a percentage of the selling price. So for example, 20% of percentage tax on cigarette. When priced at $5, consumers have to pay $1 of tax. That's a simple calculation. 5 times 0.2, which is $1. But when the price gets higher, for example $30, that makes that creates $6 of tax in consumer, which means that in percentage tax, as price gets higher, the amount of tax paid by consumer will increase. Okay, so next, what happens in supply and demand when there's an indirect tax? Here we need to focus on supply curve, not the demand curve. Okay, so for specific tax, as you can see on the diagram, supply curve, here the original supply curve, shifts upwards by the amount of specific tax. So as I said before, at any price level, the amount of tax imposed is the same. So, which causes the curve to shift upwards in a parallel position. Okay, so maybe it's maybe it can be let's use a pen. Oh. Maybe it's $1, maybe. But at this price level, at this price level, this price level. Okay. At this price level, the tax imposed is $1, and in this price level, the amount of tax imposed is also $1. So always the same amount of tax for specific tax. Okay, and then the second one, the percentage tax, as I said before, as the price gets higher, the amount of tax imposed will be greater. So first, when the price is low, the gap between the original supply curve and the supply plus tax curve is close to each other. But as price gets higher, the gap between those two curves gets greater. Okay, that's what happens on supply curve when there's specific tax and percentage tax. Okay, so next, what we need to consider is how does indirect tax affect various stakeholders. So in IB economics paper 1 and paper 2, evaluation section is necessary. In evaluation section, we need to think about different stakeholders, which we're talking about consumers, producers, and government. How does indirect tax affects consumers, producers, and government? Okay, so let's start off from government. Okay, so here is the diagram when there's a specific tax. Okay, so bear in mind that we're talking about specific tax, not percentage tax. Okay, so this is the diagram that shows the situation of specific indirect tax. Okay, so as I explained before, there is a shift in supply curve by the amount of tax imposed. Okay, so we're looking at government revenue. So government gains its revenue after indirect tax. Yeah, because because consumers and producers pay indirect tax to the government, which means the government gains tax revenue. And in this diagram, we can identify the revenue box that government will collect from indirect tax. So here, let's look at the original equilibrium and the new equilibrium formed here. Okay. So, as I said before, at this price level, supply curve shifts by this amount, which means this gap shows the amount of tax, right? So looking at the new equilibrium, the gap between the new equilibrium and the quantity level that of Q1 here, this XY shows the amount of tax, right? So the revenue box, tax revenue, will be this blue box, because at this price price level, this this much product is produced. Q1, 0Q1 is the amount of quantity produced. So the here it says amount of tax times the quantity. So XY times 0Q1, which shows this blue box. Okay. So next we're looking at producer. The producer revenue is lost after indirect tax is imposed. Okay, so first we are looking at the original equilibrium, which is this is the original equilibrium, where the price is PE and the quantity is QE, which means the producer revenue is this big box, big square. This is the producer revenue before indirect tax is imposed. And after indirect tax is imposed, let's look at the new equilibrium here, where the price is P1 and the quantity is Q1. Okay, so when at this new equilibrium, the producer revenue is this long rectangular box. This will be the producer revenue after indirect tax. However, this doesn't mean that producers receive this whole revenue. We need to consider the amount of tax paid to the government, right? So as we discussed before, the amount of tax paid to the government is this, right? This box, which means that even though new equilibrium forms this big producer revenue box, this tax paid to the government will be lost, which means this bottom box will be the new producer revenue after indirect tax, which means revenue is lost after indirect tax. Okay. The last stakeholders, it's both consumers and producers, but it's a tax burden, which is a share of tax among consumers and producers. How are they shared? So same, we look at the tax revenue, the government tax revenue box, this one, and in this box, the top box here is the tax burden for consumers, and the bottom box will be the tax burden for producers. In this diagram, where the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply are equal, the tax imposed on product is shared equally among consumers and producers. This box shows the share of tax among them. However, we're not going to talk about this in this video, but in the next video I'm going to talk about it's not always that the tax is shared equally among consumers and producers. There are situations where consumers pay more than producers, and vice versa. That depends on the price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. So I hope to see you guys in the next video. We're going to talk about how tax is shared among consumers and producers in different situations.